Take a slow, even breath and let the day loosen its grip. As you settle, picture London under a soft curtain of night, narrow lanes washed with a faint glow, the Thames turning slow as thought, and the murmured life of a great city folding itself toward rest. In that hush, we will follow the life of a man who learned to read the city's quiet maps and write his name across its margins. Billy Hill, once called the boss of Britain's underworld. This is his story told gently, with space for your breath, with time enough for your thoughts to unspool and grow light. He was born William Charles Hill in Seven Dials, a corner of London where the streets meet like spokes, and the buildings lean in as if whispering. Seven Dials had known wealth in earlier centuries, but by the early 20th it held working people, strugglers, the unlucky and the unstoppable. Children played in alleys, mothers shaped dinners from small ingredients, and fathers came and went with the day's grit still on their hands. Billy's childhood, like many there, carried two lessons. Life would not be easy, and order, when you could make it, was precious. He watched everything, the way a policeman's eyes shifted before he turned a corner, the way a bookmaker's fingers drummed when a bet ran against him, the way a landlady sighed and counted cash with an ear for the coin's ring. Billy was not large, but he learned early that a quiet boy with a quick mind could walk beside taller men and keep pace. School gave him letters enough to read a bill and a headline. The streets gave him apprenticeship in the other curriculum, timing, posture, patience, and the kind of courage that looks like calm. As a teenager, he ran small errands that skirted the law. A parcel from one door to another, a message delivered without a name attached. A tip passed to a man at a corner who paid for it with enough to buy dinner. He worked at markets and found that numbers comforted him, percentages, shares, cuts, and costs. The underworld is a business, and business rewards the mind that can balance books no one else writes down. He learned to talk softly and to leave a silence where a threat might go if it were needed. London after the First World War was tired and changing. Men home from the trenches sought work. Men who had not gone abroad tried to stretch the city's thin resources. In that stretch, shadow economies grew. Illegal betting had long been part of British life, but now it braided itself into neighborhoods like twine holding a parcel together. Racecourses became islands where money moved in waves, out from pockets and back in, and farther out again toward people who held the right positions. Billy learned those positions and taught himself how to move men into them without raising his voice. The 1930s taught him the value of networks. A club needs alcohol. Alcohol needs a supplier. A supplier needs guarantees. Guarantees require men who can keep their word even when their word is not law. Billy built such chains. He was not the heaviest hand in a room. He was often the man who suggested which hand should move and when. He paid attention to dress, to diction, to the small courtesies that make suspicious men relax. Where another might bang a fist, he angled a conversation. Where another might swagger, he arrived precisely on time and let punctuality do part of the work. War returned and London darkened. Blackouts turned the city to a geometry of outlines. Ration books structured meals, and scarcity gave ordinary items a new kind of shine. In scarcity, black markets bloom. Billy saw not only profits but patterns, perishable goods that demanded speed, luxuries like silk that demanded secrecy, fuel and tobacco that demanded routes invisible to daytime eyes. His network grew across docks and vans and cellars. Men who never would have met in ordinary commerce found themselves acting as links in a chain whose strength was discretion. The dance halls stayed open when they could. Music softened the sharp edges of fear. In the cloakrooms and back corridors, arrangements kept order. Billy believed a safe room was a profitable one. If trouble drifted toward a doorway, it was met and turned back like a tide meeting a seawall. He paid fairly and demanded the same. In that balance, men who served him found they could sleep. In the underworld, sleep is not guaranteed. He valued it as a currency richer than coin. When the war ended, scarcity did not. Rationing persisted and black markets continued their shadow work. Billy widened his operations with care, preferring steady flows to noisy windfalls. Bookmakers on the racecourses paid for the security of their pitches. Club owners paid for predictable evenings. Truckloads of goods moved with the regularity of honest schedules, though their origins and destinations wore false names. He cultivated a reputation as a man who could be dealt with, and that phrase sits at the center of his career. He could be dealt with. He kept his word and expected others to keep theirs. Yet there was another name in the same circles, a figure of the East End whose roots lay deeper in the markets. Jack Spot Comer. Where Billy smoothed, Jack shaped. Where Billy controlled through relationships spread wide, Jack controlled through presence concentrated hard. Their worlds overlapped. Clubs, courses, runners, and rooms where the air felt heavier because exchanges of money made it so. A rivalry formed, as they sometimes do in cities that can hold only so much influence before it spills. Rivalry in that time and place was a slow war fought with favors, percentages, and the tilt of loyalties. A bookmaker who paid a cut to one might be courted by the other with a marginally more generous rate, and the promise that he would never see a broken chair again. A club that bought its piece from Billy might be visited by men from Jack who asked whether the piece felt as complete as it could. Messages often arrived as corrections to invoices rather than as insults to faces. It was business, but business conducted at a temperature that could scald without boiling. Billy stayed deliberate. He visited in daylight. He spoke in sentences that sounded like agreements even when they were instructions. Jack worked in a tone that suggested history and obligation, the older code of East End protection. Between them, the city's second economy split and reformed, like mercury into beads and back into a single shining drop whenever the heat changed. There were incidents that newspapers liked, fights dressed as misunderstandings, meetings that ended with one man in hospital and three men telling three different stories. Lawyers stood between temperature and consequence. Scotland Yard watched attentively. The post-war years were a time of institutional resolve. Officials did not wish to see private arrangements governing public evenings. Files thickened. Names appeared in typed lines and handwritten margins. Arrests were made. Some trials ended in acquittal, some in cautions, some in sentences that felt like interruptions rather than endings. At his height, Billy could move money and men with a phone call, could arrange quiet outcomes in rooms that preferred to remain unnamed, could guarantee that a day at the races passed pleasantly for those who paid for the privilege. He liked a good suit and the ritual of a well-kept diary. He liked knowing that when someone said, "We'll see Billy," it meant the matter would be handled. He cultivated relationships beyond the usual borders of his trade. Shopkeepers who appreciated order around their premises. Drivers who appreciated runs that began and ended without surprises. Doormen who appreciated an evening that kept its dignity. Jack Comer did not fade. If anything, his concentration of force became sharper when tested. The city's underworld learned to navigate between two centers of gravity. There were days when the balance held and everyone earned. There were nights when the balance shifted and phones rang hurriedly. It is said that one of the measures of a man in such a world is how others speak of him when he is not present. Men spoke of Billy as clever and calm, and of Jack as formidable and immediate. For a time, London had space for both ways of being powerful. But time changes the grammar of power. The 1950s brought new players, different ambitions, and a culture that began to admire spectacle more than quiet control. The Kray twins, Ronnie and Reggie, were drawing sharp outlines for themselves in the East End and beyond. Where Billy had preferred arrangements out of the spotlight and Jack preferred an older neighborhood's notion of standing, the Krays understood the value of headlines, of photographs, of a brand. Nightclubs became stages in more ways than one. Public attention turned toward men who welcomed it. Legal pressure also grew. New policing strategies aimed to untie the knots of private governance that men like Billy had tied. Courts grew less tolerant of the notion that certain kinds of business were to be sorted among gentlemen with firm handshakes. Trials began to move from theatre to mechanism, less room for personality, more for process. In such rooms, Billy's quiet excellence at conversation found less purchase. The odds turned, if only slightly at first, but enough that a prudent man could read the drift. He began to step back. Not all at once, because nothing in his life had ever been done all at once, but in measured stages. A distance here, a delegation there, a venture that wore its legality more proudly than its predecessors. He had always believed that the best way to survive a fight is to be the one who defines what constitutes a fight. Now he believed that the best way to keep what mattered was to be the one who defined what constituted enough. Enough is a concept that men in his world rarely find, but he found a version of it and held on. Billy was not sentimental. He did not pretend his past had been a public service, but he did believe in order, even if he had enforced an order that worked primarily for those who paid him. In later interviews he could be wry, offering a line that made a reporter smile while saying very little that could draw new trouble. He understood what the public wanted and what the law permitted. He drew the two circles and stood in their overlap as a man might stand under a modest awning during rain, dry enough for now. As the 1960s advanced, the Krays and other new figures commanded the chatter. Billy's name appeared less often, not because he had been erased, but because he had chosen not to write it in large letters any longer. Friends saw him as measured, dapper, pleased by a good day's logistics, even when the logistics concerned nothing more than a lunch that arrived precisely on time. He had lived for years by the clock and the calendar. Freedom for him might have felt like owning them rather than being owned. If we pause now, we can walk, slowly and safely, through one of those days when his influence was quiet but sure. Imagine a morning on the edge of the West End. A cafe opens its doors. The proprietor nods to a porter who once helped out on a night when the bottles arrived late. Somewhere across town, a bookmaker checks his book for the afternoon's meetings and notes that a particular pitch has been promised to him without fuss. A driver glances at a route drawn on a scrap, avoiding two streets where traffic snarls and one street where attention snags, and smiles because he knows the day will run smoothly. We can move forward again. Billy's later years held fewer risks and more recollections. He had seen London survive bombs and shortages, scandals and renaissances. He had watched neighborhoods change their accents, restaurants change their menus, and the city itself change its pace. He had known men who rose like fireworks and men who made themselves steady like lamplight. He had been in his time both spark and lamp. He did not require monuments. He settled for being remembered correctly by those whose jobs had once depended on the steadiness he supplied. There are, of course, moments that memory holds brightly. He and Jack Spot had contested control over the things that elude control. Contracts signed in air, agreements written on faces and carried in pockets like invisible cards. There were bruises in that contest, and worse, and silence after some of it, because silence is a second currency for such men. There were also surprising courtesies. A bouquet sent to a wife after an unpleasant evening, with a note that suggested the sender preferred not to dwell on the unpleasantness. Civility used as both shield and message. Now let the pace slow further. Hear the muted city again, the distant rumble of buses, the feathered, fading laughter from a street where a club has closed its door for the night, the river correcting its path around the piers. Billy Hill's life, laid out in gentle sequence, becomes a diagram of choices measured against consequences. He chose presence without spectacle. He chose control expressed as calm. He chose to step back before stepping back was forced upon him. These are not moral absolutes. They are preferences practiced so long they became character. If your eyes grow heavy, you can let the rest of this pass by like scenery from a train window. We can recall the rivalry with Jack once more, not to stir adrenaline but to file it neatly. Two models of authority negotiating the same city. We can recall the wartime markets, not to glamorize them but to understand how scarcity reshapes ethics and prices both. We can recall the racecourses, mud, chalked odds on a board, the murmured prayer of a punter counting notes, and see how a pitched rectangle of turf can become a stage where invisible contracts are enforced by men who never sign their names. There are stories that attach themselves to Billy's name like small, persistent birds. The clever robbery planned as if it were a timetable. The phone call that prevented a foolish beating. The night he declined a profitable idea because it required a public mess he would not tolerate. The afternoon he corrected a debt in a manner so precise the debtor thanked him afterward for the clarity. These may be true. They may be adjusted by retelling. What matters for our quiet purpose is the outline they draw. A man who believed that order, even a private order, was preferable to chaos. And so we arrive at the end of the map with our pace intact. Billy Hill stepped away from the center and lived long enough to watch his own legend become an old story told by younger men. He was not a hero. He would not have called himself a villain. He was a specialist in arrangements at a time when arrangements were the city's hidden skeleton. When the Krays moved the stage lights, the audience changed, and Billy preferred to leave the theater rather than shout from the back row. There is a sort of wisdom in that, practical and unromantic. Rest now with a simple picture. A small office with a window onto a busy street, a neat desk, a neat suit jacket folded over the back of a chair, a diary open to a page with 3 names and 3 times, all met, all checked off. Outside, London moves with its million errands. Inside, a man closes the diary and turns off a lamp. Work finished, for the day and finally, for the era. If you are still awake, let your breath find that comfortable rhythm again, in through the nose, out through the mouth. The story has done its work. Billy Hill's lines cross London's map and then fade as new lines are drawn. What endures is the city itself and the calm you can borrow from its night, the way the great machine grows quiet, the way the river keeps its counsel, the way footsteps sound softer after midnight. You can keep only the outline. A boy from 7 Dials, a mind that prized order, a career that treated calm as currency. The night is kind, the city sleeps. Your body knows how to follow. Breathe once more, slowly. Let the last of the story drift and settle. You are safe. Sleep.